Welcome to Cybersecurity Where You Are, the Center for Internet Security's podcast. I'm Sean Atkinson, CISO at CIS.
And I'm Tony Sager, Senior Vice President and Chief Evangelist at CIS. Cybersecurity affects us all, whether we're online at home, managing a company, supporting clients, or running a state or local government.
So join us on Wednesdays as we discuss trends and threats, explore security best practices, and interview experts in the industry.
Together, we'll clarify these issues, creating confidence in the connected world.
Hello and welcome to the show, Cybersecurity Where You Are. I'm Sean Atkinson, CISO here at the Center for Internet Security, joined by Mr. Ed Scotus, President of the SANS Technical Institute, founder of Counter Hack Challenges, the Godfather himself. Ed, welcome to the show.
Thank you. I'm so glad to be here. Godfather, oh my goodness.
And we also want to welcome Ben Wilcox to the show. Ben, you are a Chief Technology Officer, a Chief Information Security Officer at ProArc. Why don't you go through your background a little bit for us as an introduction to our audience?
Well, thank you, Shauna, for having me on. Ben Wilcox. I've been at ProArc for, this is actually going to be my 20th year. I came up through a technical background, also a bit of a mix of business. I started early on in the internet days in the 1990s, having a web hosting company, which I built as a teenager and grew into basically the dot-com bubble burst. At that point, I kind of switched over into the system integrator side, where I took more hands-on roles doing things around data, SharePoint, and then kind of led more into doing things with cloud services, operational technology, cybersecurity. And today, I'm kind of responsible for making sure that ProArc has great solutions that are secure, that are trusted, and help our customers leverage AI in new ways.
Fantastic. Ed, it takes us on a little bit of a journey here. And the topic that we're looking at today is AI and operational technology data. And in some cases, as we talk to Ben, it's going to be figuring out the implementation of AI, the management of data in OT systems, and how there's a difference between IT, OT, the information security paradigm around those areas. So, Ed, I wanted to get your thoughts, as we start this conversation and we talk to Ben, really starting to think about how we integrate and understand AI in those environments as well.
Yeah. And I mean, it's really important to understand the OT environments, because that's what, keeps our lights on. That's what keeps water flowing. Whenever we do a penetration test, we're always super careful in those environments. And, I cut my teeth and learned pretty much everything I know about ICS and OT from Mike Asante, whom I know, Sean, you knew Mike. I don't know, Ben, if you knew Mike. But he was such an incredible person. And he used to talk to me about the data historians and how important those data historians are. And they're often a jump off point between the IT and the OT environment, because the IT wants to get the data in the data historian. And now you sprinkle AI on top of that, and it adds an order of magnitude or more of complexity to the whole thing. Also, every year, Ben, I don't know if you know this, Sean, I think you do. We do a top 5 threats and attacks to worry about keynote session at RSA conference. And this year we had Rob M. Lee from Dragos. He did one of our 5 topics, and his topic was about putting AI in OT environments, boosting the complexity so much that it is nearly impossible for the human mind to understand. So he viewed that as a big threat. And I would love to hear, Ben react to that, and to tell us about what his knowledge is to help mitigate that concern and make sure we can understand what's going on in our OT environments. So that's what I'm here for, and I think it's going to be really cool.
Yeah, I would say AI embedded within the operational technology side of it definitely scares me a bit. When you start thinking about, right, if we kind of go break down what the difference is between like IT and OT, right, and what maybe the different types of what they're responsible for, and when it comes to data, right, is the IT side. I like to think of it as your IT side has all of the business data, right? It's your unstructured, it could be structured data, it could be things about how your business operates. Your OT is physical process data, right? How your operations is actually physically producing, whatever widget it is that you're creating there, whether it's an electron or a part. And so, AI, because I think of, and we could think of probably AI based off of a couple different concepts, right? It's easy to think about it from the LLM model or generative AI side of things, which we still don't completely fully understand how it gets to it, but we do know it. It does take its best guess, and that's not always the best option when it comes to physical things that have like real constraints. Um, but I think that there's a lot of advantage if we go back to maybe some of the more traditional AI types of things like machine learning, right? Understanding what's common steps, like those have some really great practical use cases. And if you kind of tie that in a bit with some of the things that generative AI can do, which is actually help speak a better language of what the technical problem is, or maybe help you guide you into the right steps, you can get to a point where I think AI can be a assistant in operational technology. Maybe we're not quite ready at the point for it to start, doing a lot of things itself. I think that's where robotics and automation really is probably key in that space.
Absolutely. Well, you think, the driven elements of automation and OT environments themselves. And, this is one of the things I was thinking about, Ben, is I've worked in environments from an operational technology perspective where plant floor, we've got decades old equipment systems, even operating systems, generating data in different formats, and how that impacts both a security overlay, but then also now that the sprinkle element, as it were, of AI in that space. And it seems like there's an ability, there is capability, right? We want to move these organizations into greater levels of security, greater levels of automation and sophistication in terms of that combination play with AI. Do you see that being either this is a quick win, this is a short term perspective, and we've got to think longer term in terms of upgrading these systems to a capability, or we meet the systems where they are? And this is long term. We're going to be working with these systems in terms of integration of that data in order to build AI capability and security around those elements.
Well, I do believe you kind of have to meet them where they are. Right? These systems are in place for a reason. Um, Oftentimes, right, maybe there's not something that is replaceable at this moment, right? It's tied to a process. It could be a huge exponential cost. Something that doesn't align with the business side of it. So I think where you come in and where I guess our approach to coming into this is, right, we do it passively, we do it incrementally, and we respect the operations that the machines are there to do. So the opposite side of it, right, or the wrong approach would be to start walking into a plant or a facility and start installing, some sort of agents, or changing the PLC logic, or forcing a modern architecture into something that might be a more fragile system. So we like passive discovery, making sure that we have a complete understanding of like asset inventories before we even touch anything. Not every facility, and that's just good security hygiene anyways, but it's the best way to understand what are the OT assets that are part of the critical systems in there. And sometimes they're known, sometimes they're unknown. I can tell you that most of the time walking into a facility that has OT, there's always something new that people have forgotten about, or isn't well documented, or is sitting on some previous diagram, but it's not on the new one. So having that on there. And then when we start talking about like, how do we get some data from these? That's where we use that existing historian that you were talking about, right? That kind of key piece that has been recording the data. It's been maybe more used just to understand the operations at this moment, right? It hasn't really been used to, maybe it's used in a manual method for going back and doing some diagnostics and so forth. But that's a great source of truth to be able to start with, and being able to extract information from and do it in a relatively safe way. When I started doing the OT work, The first things I was really doing was segmenting and making sure that had good separation between that historian and the OT environments. That's what we started doing back in the late 2000s. Is putting in those firewalls, getting the one-way transport rules in place, and so a lot of the environments already have those. So starting there, that gives something really good. And generally, those are like read-only interfaces today, so very safe, right? You could be pulling it from a couple vendors out there, Aviva Pi. There's one called like Ignition. Sometimes we can get stuff from even just data dumps, right? SCADA exports. There's OPC servers. There's all these different types of platforms out there that we can really support just kind of like a read-only side of it. Now, the next key piece, I think, right, is oftentimes what we're doing on the AI side results in using cloud. So we want to make sure that we have a really safe space to be able to use from like a data perspective. So if you want to call it a data bridge or something else, but basically creating another industrial DMZ or some sort of brokered replication that can allow just a one-way communication outbound, right? To being able to get that data into a cloud system. It's going to be way easier to scale. It's going to be able to do it much quicker in that manner. And then as we start being able to use that data, there might be other contexts that we want to be able to work with. Some of it will be getting data from other systems because you're not going to necessarily get all the things you want from just one system. That other piece out there. So we might have to start doing some other one-way pushes to be able to get that, or once we have the data, trying to normalize it and getting it into the right set, because you could be having things from different platforms, right? Things that are not in sync from a time perspective. And then once we have all that information, we try to validate it, right, with the operations and the engineering. That OT tribal knowledge that the facility maintenance folks have, the engineers have, really can help kind of fill in the gaps when it comes to missing metadata that's needed to be able to leverage AI in these older systems.
And I think that's great. I mean, it's very important that you pull that stuff very carefully. But my next question for you, Ben, is okay, to what end? Now that assuming we get that data in a safe fashion, what is the promise of AI in helping to improve whether it's safety, security, operations, efficiency? What paint that picture for us, because that's why we're doing this, right?
Yeah. Well, there's great stuff when it comes to efficiencies. Give one example here. You take something that's 15, 20 years old, right? It started as a piece of physical machinery that's had a typical operating scale, and it's when it was operating perfectly, right? There's a nice curve there where it's producing its widgets and so forth. As it ages, and this is true with any piece of machinery, right? The efficiencies there start going down. It's not quite as efficient as it used to be. And these older machines, right, they aren't necessarily capable of detecting when they're not necessarily being as efficient. Right? You might not have as much real-time things. You might not have an understanding of, hey, this pump, for example, isn't putting out the types of, isn't supporting the plant putting out the types of electrons or whatever it is that it was previously doing. And you're starting to lose some of your output. But what is it on that pump that's causing that, right? If you're not looking right at the right sensors, you're not going to be able to kind of understand what it is. So if we go back and look at like the historian data in there, we can and tie it up with, for example, hey, you had an outage or a known problem here. We can start mapping what is typical in that facility today. Where is there deviations that are occurring, right? Where production output's going down, and then tying that back into a known outage for X amount of reasons, we can start predicting future outages much faster, right? We don't have to wait for something to completely fail. We can start seeing, hey, let's go back, 24 hours. Do we see any sort of behavior characteristics that were indicative of this turning into a problem? Now we can surface those through machine learning in real time. Now you pair that into, okay, operator, now you have a problem or a predicted problem. We have a very grounded set of instructions of how to repair that. you've been able to kind of surface that much quicker. They're not having to go scroll through a bunch of other materials, and being able to get them to be, think of it as like AI assisted, um, you know, recovery on that front. So efficiencies, maybe even human safety, right? These things all have, high pressure, a lot of the stuff, right? Hot pumps, any of those types of things. Valves, you might have things that are high pressure. If you're starting to detect a failure someplace or something looks a little odd, um, you know, I think AI can be assistive in protecting human life as well.
Absolutely agree. We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, I want to go over some of the data governance lifecycle elements, friction points between IT and OT teams, and then what Ben recommends to be AI ready for the OT operating environment. With that, we'll be right back.
Ever feel like cybersecurity is a giant jigsaw puzzle and someone forgot to give you the corner pieces?
Or the box lid, the table, all the time.
Exactly. That's where the CIS Secure Suite platform comes in.
It's your intuitive starting point for cybersecurity. One dashboard with the functionality of Syscat Pro dashboard and CIS CSAT Pro built in.
From policy to implementation, it puts the puzzle together for you. CIS controls? Check. CIS benchmarks? Double check.
And it's built for CIS Secure Suite members. You're getting a streamlined experience with the guidance that turns data into decisions.
Like seeing where your biggest risks are and knowing exactly what to do next. Share results easily with internal security teams from one great tool.
Plus, it helps you align with frameworks like NIST and ISO, making you audit ready.
Whether you're a small team or a cyber underdog, the platform gives you the visibility, clarity, and confidence to act.
So if you're ready to stop guessing and start securing, visit cisecurity.org/SecureSuite to learn more.
CIS Secure Suite Platform. Cybersecurity simplified.
Okay, we're back. Ben, one of the things I wanted to pick up on that you mentioned before was respect the operations. I love that. Respect what exists as we move into this space. And I think that's so important because I think we lose maybe sight of, oh, well, these systems should be upgraded. And I've worked in environments where, no, you don't touch that system because it's the only one on the East Coast. So you leave it alone and, don't go near it. Okay, no worries. We'll leave that one out. We'll make sure it's air gapped and controlled, but we'll make sure we don't interfere with its operation. But I think that comes up with some of the lifecycle management, specifically in some of the data governance pieces. So when we're looking at OT data, right? We mentioned the historian, we mentioned a process, we mentioned through Ed's question, the need for this data and what you looked for this to be part of an entire operation consideration in terms of tolerances, quality, human safety, and predictive elements through machine learning. That's absolutely fantastic. And really the reason why we move into these spaces. But when we look at that lifecycle management, does that look different when we're thinking about operational technology and its data, where we need to retain that information for a certain period of time, or there's certain controls around that data we want to protect, as it could be protected intellectual property of an underlying process that is something that we also want to consider when we're sharing this with AI models and things of that nature. Any thoughts there, Ben?
Yeah, I think that there's still a need for governance, lifecycle management for this type of data, especially if you start looking at making decisions around it, being able to align and keep an understanding of how you got to a decision. I think is kind of key in all sorts of modern data platforms, right? In the IT side, it's how do we get to that financial number, right? In the OT side, it would be how do we get to a point where we're making a decision around possibly changing a process that's occurring at this time. So in the OT realm, I'd say like that governance really gets into the asset hierarchy, where that equipment is, right? What line, what site, what cell, etc. Sometimes I know in manufacturing, I had a friend who worked in as an engineering manager in a very large automotive part manufacturer, and they would lose these big pieces of equipment because they shift the line around, right? And this facility's huge, right? Hundreds of thousands of square feet, and this piece of equipment would disappear, and someone moved it somewhere, and they didn't find it for a week. Um, but where does that fit into that line, and how does that you're making the right decision around that piece of equipment at that time? So understanding some of those things, I think like retention tiers, right? What's right, and understanding high frequency data sets. We have historian data. Maybe there's specific events that are occurring that you want to keep for a certain period of time. How do we get to that decision on that side? I think latency also is really an interesting point. So in OT, right, it's about being able to get this information quickly, because you want to understand what's kind of happening in real time. But there's different sets of real time that might be of more value and less value. So, for example, going back to a previous case where we're talking about this pump. Originally, when we started doing that work, we thought, well, hey, this is needing to be done, and near real time, right? Well, turns out the pump doesn't need real time monitoring. Every couple minutes was okay. So the velocity of the data types that were coming in changed quite a bit, and that also changed how long we have to restore things for. Because if we're talking about 1,000 events per second, and now we're going into one event every 5 minutes or every few minutes, that's a totally different set of velocity. So understanding kind of where that comes from the governance perspective is kind of key about how you're going to retain that stuff and what you're going to be doing. And then I think that when it comes to the security side, right, who has access to this model, right? The engineering, the operators, vendor, IT, security, etc. Those things have to be kind of defined as well. So if you were to kind of go look at the OT side, right? OT governance isn't just about who can access the data. It's really gets into being whether it's safe for your specific operational decision that you need.
One of the things, Ben, I really liked what you said in the setup before the break, but also in your answer just now, is the word understanding. And I was kind of counting the number of times you said the word understanding, because leveraging AI in these environments can actually help us understand what the reality of it is, which is um, was the worry that Rob Emley brought up at the RSA conference of, this thing is already pretty complicated. Leveraging AI on top of it can make it even more complicated. Your approach is to say, no, let's not do that. Let's leverage AI so we can make the whole thing more understandable. And I really liked how you emphasized that in your response there.
Yeah. Well, it's critical, I think, because Ed, we've talked about this before. Is as you approach organizations, it's understanding the assets, understanding data, understanding the business function as part of that realization of how we integrate and how your teams can be helpful in the space in order to provide the most value. Where I see this, Ben, and I've seen this before, and I wanted to get your thoughts because you did mention, we've got the IT teams responsible for the business technology element of IT. And then we have engineering responsible for OT. And it seems like there could be some friction points in both an understanding of IT necessarily. We'll use this example. We want to move fast. We want to use cloud scale capability to integrate AI. Where OT is, well, these are safety critical systems. We got to control the data. We got to manage what's feeding the model, what the model is feeding elsewhere, and who owns that model. It seems like when we're trying to build the shared data strategy, there could be some friction between the two. And I think understanding comes into that in, from both sides, as it were, to represent both points from both a functional, non-functional perspective in order to move forward in this space. And we all see, I think, that the pathing forward is an AI path, an AI era that we're entering from both IT and OT. So when you see those friction points, Ben, how do you iron those out and bring together a strategy that's cohesive?
Yeah, those friction points definitely exist. I have never been in a facility where they're like, "Oh, go ahead and make a change over there in space." That doesn't exist. And if we think about kind of the traditional IT side of it, right, it's pretty rapid changes. I mean, look at our patch cycles these days. Everyone patches critical things as fast as they possibly can, and OT, you kind of wait till you get your planned, change windows. And those windows are infrequent, maybe at best quarterly, sometimes biannually. Um, and like it's a little different when it comes to like the speed of things operating. IT operates much faster than the OT's changes.
Yeah.
And then if I could kind of go back to another analogy here, right, is if we look at like what we're seeing with architecture on the IT side, right, we're seeing centralized platforms, centralized, it doesn't matter if you're choosing, a security platform or productivity platform, right? You get, one thing and then, it does lots of it. And OT is really about being like, it's all the systems, even from the network layer, right? It's all supposed to be segmented. It's deterministic based off of a process that's there. These systems don't necessarily talk to each other. They may be involved in a process, but that process doesn't necessarily correlate. And you could have different manufacturers in there. It's can be very complex. Um, and then when it comes to like, I guess maybe what's prioritized there. The traditional IT side is really about CIA, right? The confidentiality, integrity, availability. But OT has a slightly different thing. It's about safety, reliability, and availability. So you end up with kind of competing forces in that, right? From that risk perspective. In the very beginning, right, when you go in and our approach is to do something very passive when it comes to the OT environment. um, IT is all about automation. Go get the stuff right. You have lots of agents all over the place, and big fast discoveries. OT is about let's look at the network traffic and figure out what we have based off of that. So if something has a funny communication protocol or something that's a sensitive piece of networking equipment, right, it can't take a big broadcast. We don't impact it. So I think for IT and OT to really kind of coming back to your question, to work together, it has to be a team sport. You have to understand what's important to both of these teams. IT can certainly build the platform that this, OT data is sitting on, working with the AI side of it. But OT really has to be there, the one there that validates the truth that's important for them, right? Their risks, their data, their understanding about how those things flow. They need to be deeply involved in that space.
Yeah, completely agree. I think, Ed, when we talk about understanding communication and partnership in that space, a lot of the times I see that between an organization and the penetration testers as well, right? It is being able to provide that value and the contribution, understanding, but constant communication between the two. I think is paramount, because there's a lot of assumptions that could be made in that space that can lead to a lot of outcomes that are neither team would want.
Right. And communications is important, but there's a translation factor too, because IT and OT people speak differently, as CISOs and pen testers often speak differently. So there's that. Those people who are able to do that translation between the various speakers as part of that communication are super important to have.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
100%.
100%. So, Ben, as we come towards the end of the episode, I wanted to get your thoughts for any organization, industrial organization, any OT operator that is looking to be AI ready to start that translation, to start building the AI capability within an organization. What would you recommend in terms of prioritization, collection, normalization, security, something else? How do they prepare to be AI ready?
So understand your assets, understand how some of the data flow goes, which will mean getting a system in place that can see that stuff. One of the security platforms would be absolutely great in that space to be able to look at what your traffic patterns are, what's normal, what's not. How's this, one system tie back into another system? does data already flow outside of your environment that you're not even aware of? That happens quite a bit in the discoveries that we come across. Secondly, right, like I think it's really critical that you don't try to take on too much. Be very specific about a use case selection. So pick an outcome, right? What do you want to kind of go after here? Is it something that's like around predictive maintenance? Do you want to try to improve the quality of something? Is there some piece of equipment out there that does has downtime, and if that equipment could be running a little bit more, or less impactful to the rest of the production, would that be better? Could be, energy is top of mind for a lot of people. It's highly costly these days, and there are energy improvements that can help undermine or underpin the bottom line and make it better. Or maybe there's something around safety, right, or security monitoring in general, like that. That's a great use case in this space. But don't try to go do everything. And then once you figure out what your use case is and you go back to your assets, now you know what you need to connect, right? So you can start with your historian exports, or maybe figuring out, hey, I got to go get a one-way replication here off of this other piece of equipment. And then start mapping all of those pieces together, right? You have your assets, your production lines, your engineering units, what's timing on those things. And so working through that, security and governance controls, right? How do we handle all of those pieces? And then it's going to get into your data quality, making sure you have good data quality there. And then only after you have good data, that's when you can bring on the AI side. That's the last and final piece.
Exactly. I see a lot of paradigm between enumeration in environments, right? From a penetration testing perspective, I see a governance structure from an IT perspective, following elements of good cyber hygiene, the CIS controls, all culminating in your advice there, Ben. And so that's absolutely fantastic. Ben, I want to thank you for sharing your expertise, your knowledge with us and our audience. I really appreciate it. Thank you, Ben.
So it's my pleasure to be on here, Sean.
Absolutely. And my partner in podcast, Ed, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
It was a joy, Sean. Thanks so much.
And to our audience, thank you so much. Remember to subscribe in all the usual ways with your preferred podcast provider. Catch us on YouTube at The CI Security. Questions, comments, concerns, email us, podcast@cisecurity.org. And with that, we'll talk to you soon.
Thank you for listening to the podcast today.
The thoughts and opinions expressed by our podcast guests are solely theirs and do not necessarily reflect those of CIS.
Tune in on Wednesdays for a new episode. And in the meantime, visit our website at cisecurity.org.
Together, we'll continue our efforts of creating confidence in the connected world.